Cordelia Thorne Ashworth, Duchess of Harrow, stood in the doorway of her own ballroom and heard her husband tell a stranger that she managed him the way a good steward manages a flock. She did not drop her glass. She did not call for her maid. She did not go to him and ask what he meant. She set the wine down on the sideboard with both hands, slowly, so it would not ring against the wood, and she closed her fingers around the small brass key she wore on a ribbon at her throat, the one that had opened her father's mill for 30 years before it had ever touched her own skin. By spring, the Duke of Harrow would learn that the woman he called useful owned the ground his own house stood on, and the mill that fed half the parish, and a title older than his, and that she had never once told him, because he had never once asked. The summer had come to Millbrook the way it always did, heavy and unhurried, laying itself over the wheat like a hand testing whether the grain was ready. It was the summer Cordelia turned 26, the summer the mill wheel needed new paddles, and the summer she stopped expecting her husband to notice either fact. Their marriage was 5 years old that August, contracted in the plain arithmetic of 2 failing households. His father's debts, her father's money, a lease on Harrow's home farm that ran through Thornland and had run out of patience with interest. Julian Ashworth had married her the autumn after his father died, grave and correct, thanking her family in a voice that had already decided gratitude and affection were separate accounts and ought to be kept that way. Cordelia had gone into the marriage believing that competence, applied steadily enough, over years enough, might be mistaken eventually for love. She had balanced his ledgers. She had corresponded with his tenants when his hand cramped from writing to creditors. She had learnt the mill her father left her so thoroughly that the foreman, a weathered man named Simon Hale, had stopped calling her my lady and started calling her ma'am, which around Millbrook was the higher honour. None of it had been noticed, because none of it had ever stopped. A thing that never stops is easy to mistake for weather. Her father, Baron Nathaniel Thorne, had died 11 months before that summer, and with him had gone the only person who called her clever, without qualifying it. He had left her 2 things she carried daily, and 1 thing she did not yet know she carried at all: the mill key on its ribbon. A small worn book of maxims he'd recited so often she could hear them in his voice before her own. And, folded somewhere she had not yet found it, the truth of exactly what belonged to her. Paper remembers what people forget, he used to say, tapping the ledger with 1 finger, and she had believed it the way children believe their fathers about most things, without yet needing it to be true. That evening, Harrow Hall was lit for a midsummer ball Julian had agreed to host at the urging of his cousin by marriage, a widow named Delphine Voss, who had attached herself to the household 8 months earlier, as a comfort, she said, to a grieving connection, and had since become difficult to unattach. Delphine moved through Harrow's rooms the way water moves through a house with a bad roof, finding every gap, filling it before anyone noticed it was empty. She was warm in company. She was warmest, Cordelia had begun to notice, exactly when something was at stake. Cordelia had gone to the sideboard for a moment's quiet, her second glass untouched, when she heard Julian's voice through the open study door, low and easy in the particular register men use when they believe themselves unheard. "She manages the accounts," he was saying, to a guest whose name she didn't catch. "Manages the house. Manages me, half the time, though she'd deny it. I don't know what I'd do without her, honestly. She's terribly useful. Useful. Not the word itself, which she had heard before and absorbed before. It was the ease of it, the way he said it, the way a man says a fact he has stopped examining. She stood very still. Somewhere near the terrace doors, Delphine Voss laughed at something Cordelia's cousin by marriage, Edmund Thorne, had murmured to her, and the two of them turned, just slightly, to look at her. The kind of look that has already had its conversation, and is only now remembering to be discreet about it. Cordelia set her glass down. She did not go to Julian. She did not confront Delphine. She went, instead, to stand by the long window, and she permitted herself 10 minutes. It was a habit her father had taught her without meaning to. He had counted his own grief in minutes after her mother died. 10 of them by the mantel clock, weeping without shame and without excess, and then rising to work, because the tenants still needed their rents recorded, whether or not a man's wife was in the ground. Cordelia had adopted the 10 minutes as her own currency, long before she understood what she was buying with it, permission to feel the thing fully, and then permission to stop. She watched the clock on the terrace. She did not weep. The grief in her that night did not look like tears. It looked like an inventory, unfolding itself with terrible calm. The house is not mine. The name is not fully mine. The husband was never mine in the way I once let myself hope. And then, quieter, arriving last the way the truest things always did, the mill is mine. The land under it is mine. My father's key is mine, and no one in this room has ever asked to see what it opens. When the 10 minutes ended, she found Tobias Reed, her father's old steward, smoking his pipe by the stable yard, where he always retreated from parties he considered a waste of good candle money. "You've the look," Tobias said, not turning, "of a woman who's stopped being surprised." "I have," Cordelia said. "Good," said Tobias. "Surprise is expensive. What'll you do instead?" She looked back at the lit windows of Harrow Hall, gold and indifferent against the dark. "I am going to go home," she said, "and open my father's books. All of them. And I am going to find out exactly what I have been too polite to use." Tobias exhaled a long ribbon of smoke and said nothing for a while, which from him was agreement. "He'll notice eventually," he said finally. "He will," Cordelia said. "That is rather the point." The mill's east sluice gate had been groaning since March, a low complaint under the wheels turning that Simon Hale had reported twice to the house, and been told, twice, that funds were tied up in the harvest accounts. Cordelia went down to the mill pond herself the morning after the ball, in a plain grey dress with her sleeves already pinned back, and stood on the bank doing the thing she had learned to do better than anyone gave her credit for, looking at a problem until it stopped being frightening and became merely a set of numbers. "Paddles are splitting," Hale told her, wading out to point. "Wheels carrying uneven. Another month like this, and we lose the whole assembly, not just the gate. What would new paddles cost, done properly, by a millwright who won't cheat us on oak? £40. Maybe 45. And what does a week's lost grinding cost the parish, if the wheel fails at harvest instead?" Hale did the sum slowly, the way a man does when he is used to being asked for opinions rather than for arithmetic. "More than £45, he admitted. "A great deal more." "Then we are not choosing between spending and saving," Cordelia said. "We are choosing between spending now, on our terms, or spending later, on the river's." She wrote to a millwright in Devizes that afternoon, in her own hand, with her father's key pressed flat on the desk beside her as she worked, as though its presence were a kind of witness. She did not write to Julian for permission. The £45 was Thorne money, from Thorne rents, and she was done asking twice for things that were already hers to spend. The repair took 9 days. Cordelia was on the bank for most of them, in weather that ruined 2 bonnets, directing timber deliveries and settling a dispute between the millwrights' men, and Hales over the placement of the cofferdam, with a patience that impressed everyone but herself, who found it merely necessary. A tenant farmer named Cobb, who had grumbled for years that a woman running accounts was a woman playing at accounts, brought her a jug of small beer on the 7th day without being asked, which around Millbrook was its own kind of testimony. Julian rode down on the 8th day, ostensibly to inspect the home farm's boundary hedge, and found his wife ankle-deep in mud, directing 12 men in the placement of new oak paddles, with the flat, unhurried authority of someone who had done this before, and would do it again. He did not say anything for a long moment. He simply watched, the particular stillness of a man recalculating a sum he had assumed was settled. "You didn't tell me the wheel was failing," he said finally. "I told the house steward in March." Twice Cordelia did not look up from the ledger she was annotating. "I've stopped telling people things that don't get written down. You've been managing this yourself." "I have been managing this since my father died, Julian. I only stopped mentioning it because mentioning it seemed to bore you." He absorbed that the way a man absorbs a blow he suspects he deserved. He did not apologize. It was not yet time in the story of them for apology, but he stood a while longer than the hedge inspection required, watching her direct a millwright's apprentice with 2 sentences where another woman might have needed 10, and something in his face did a small, grudging arithmetic of its own. It was not a smile. Cordelia noted, privately, that it was the beginning of one, the first quarter-inch of a thing that would take months to become anything at all. She did not know yet that Edmund Thorne had spent that same week in Crane's office in the county town, asking, with great courtesy, to see the old Thorne entail papers, on the grounds that a cousin ought to understand the family's affairs. Miss Aldous Crane, precise and unhurried as any good solicitor, had shown him only what was properly public, and made a note, out of habit more than suspicion, of exactly what Edmund had asked to see. The second trial came in September, and it was not the river's fault but men's. Word had gone round Millbrook that a syndicate out of Devizes was paying mill hands 11 shillings a week 2 parishes over, and Hale came to Cordelia white-lipped with the news that 4 of her best men were considering the walk. Thorne Mill paid 9. She did not argue that 9 was fair. She sat with the ledger for a night, and found, in the process, exactly what her father's competence had always found, that the mill could pay 10.5, if the flour contracts were renegotiated with the Millbrook bakers directly instead of through a middling factor, who took a cut for doing nothing but standing between 2 honest parties. She renegotiated the contracts herself, in a room with 3 bakers who had known her since she was a girl trailing after her father with ink on her fingers, and she posted the new wage on the mill door the following Monday, in her own hand, with the date and her name beneath it. Cordelia Thorne, on behalf of Thorne Mill, not the Duchess of Harrow. She noticed, writing it, that it was the first time in 5 years she had signed anything with only her own name, and that it felt less like a diminishment than like putting down something heavy she had been asked to carry sideways for a very long time. The 4 men stayed. Word of the wage posting reached Harrow Hall by way of servants before it reached Julian by way of his wife, which by then neither of them found remarkable. It was Mrs. Agnes Purdy, the Harrow housekeeper, blunt as good bread, who told Cordelia something else that autumn, not gossip exactly, but the sort of household fact that housekeepers accumulate the way ledgers accumulate figures. His Grace's mother, Mrs. Purdy said, folding linens with the flat precision of a woman who has folded 10,000 of them, left when he was 11. ran off with a steward from the neighbouring estate, if you want the plain of it, and his lordship, the old duke that is, never spoke her name again in this house. Told the boy affection was a thing clever people used to rob honest ones. I heard him say it myself, more than once, right in front of the child. She set the linen down. Man spent 20 years being careful not to be robbed. Doesn't leave much room for being loved, does it? Cordelia said nothing for a while. It did not excuse the word useful. It explained a great deal about the man who had needed, for 20 years, a category for people that did not require trusting them. Meanwhile, the county had begun, slowly, to speak of her differently. Not as the Duchess who managed things, but as the Duchess whose mill paid its hands honestly, and whose word, once given, did not need chasing. It moved through Millbrook the way water moves downhill, without hurry and without any possibility of being argued out of its direction. Delphine Voss noticed the change first, and did not like it. She was seen, that same week, walking the lane toward the Millbrook parish clerk's office with Edmund Thorne, the two of them deep in a conversation that stopped entirely when a farmhand passed close enough to greet them. Julian noticed something too, though it took him longer to name it. He found himself 3 evenings running, drawn to the estate office after supper instead of to his own study, ostensibly to review accounts actually, though he would not yet have said so aloud, to watch his wife work by lamplight, her pen moving with a certainty he had never once thought to ask where it came from. "You've never told me," he said on the 3rd evening, "what your father actually left you." "I assumed the mill. I never asked what else." Cordelia looked up. It was, she thought, the first real question he had asked her in 5 years that was not about his own accounts. "No," she agreed. "You never did." She did not answer it that night. She let it sit, unanswered, the way a good creditor lets interest accrue on a debt someone else has finally noticed they owe. The unravelling of Delphine Voss began, as it happened, over a rival that turned out not to be a rival at all. Julian confronted her in late October, in the small parlour off the library, after a week in which he had watched her press him twice, gently, insistently, about whether the Thorne lease on Harrow's home farm might not be simplified, perhaps assigned outright to the dukedom, perhaps arranged through Edmund, who after all understood the family's interests so well. "You've never once asked after Cordelia's health," Julian said, "or her grief, or anything at all that isn't the lease. I find that curious in a woman who claims to love this family." Delphine's composure did not crack, not yet. She was smooth as poured cream. And cream does not crack. It only, eventually, turns. "I only want what's best for Harrow," she said. "Harrow," Julian said slowly, "is not yours to want things for." He dismissed her from the house that week, courteously, with a settlement his solicitor thought overgenerous, and Julian privately thought was the cheapest thing he had ever bought. Certainty. It was the same week he opened his father's old strongbox, which had sat locked in the estate office since the funeral because no one had wanted the trouble of the key. Inside, beneath a stack of unpaid tradesmen's bills the old Duke had been too proud to settle, Julian found the original marriage settlement, his father's cramped apologetic hand alongside Baron Thorne's clean one, and a clause he had genuinely never read in full, the 99-year lease on Harrow's home farm, granted by the Thorne barony, renewable only by the personal signature of the current Thorne heir, due within 1 year of the previous holder's death. Her father had died 11 months ago. Julian sat with that for a long time before he went to find her. He did not apologize that night. He was not yet capable of the whole of it. And some instinct in him, newly honest, recognised the difference and did not attempt the counterfeit. He simply sat down across the desk from her, the strongbox papers between them, and said, "I have spent 5 years thinking I was generous to marry a fortune I understood. I did not understand it at all. I do not think I have understood you at all." Cordelia set down her pen. "No," she said, "you haven't. Tell me what would begin to fix it. Not tonight," she said, "and not with words. Show me. Over time. I have watched you be sorry before, Julian. I have never watched you be different." She reached up and unclasped the ribbon at her throat, the mill key warm from her skin, and set it, not gave it, set it, deliberately, between them on the desk. "I need this taken to Crane tomorrow." Unlocked, witnessed, and returned. I would ordinarily send Hale. I am sending you instead, because I want to see whether you can be trusted with a small thing before I decide about the large ones. Julian looked at the key for a long moment. The way a man looks at a test he understands is a test. "All right," he said. "All right, then," said Cordelia, and it was, in its small way, the first treaty of their marriage that either of them had meant. Mr. Aldous Crane's office smelled of dust and beeswax and 40 years of other people's secrets. It was there, going through Baron Thorne's private papers at Cordelia's request. Julian standing witness, silent in the corner, that Crane found the sealed will her father had lodged with him 3 years before his death, superseding an older, simpler document everyone in the county had assumed was the only one. It was explicit in a way the old will was not. The barony of Thorne, the mill, and Thorne Hall's lands passed by strict entail through blood, to Cordelia, and after her to her lawful issue, with no provision whatsoever for collateral male heirs, while a direct line survived. It named her, specifically, executor of the lease renewal, sole and absolute. "Your cousin asked to see the old entail in July," Crane said, adjusting his spectacles. "I noted it at the time. I did not think much of it. I think somewhat more of it now." Piece by piece, over the following weeks, the shape of it assembled itself the way Cordelia's father had taught her ledgers always eventually did. If you were patient, and did not flinch from the columns that didn't balance. Simon Hale came forward, unprompted, to say that a stranger claiming to be a surveyor had asked him, back in August, oddly specific questions about the mill's timber accounts and the exact wording of old boundary stones, a man later identified, through the Devises Coach Office's records, as having been paid by Edmund Thorne. A letter surfaced, tucked carelessly into a book Delphine had left behind in her hurried departure, addressed to Edmund in her own hand, discussing a syndicate's interest in leasing the home farm cheap, once matters were, as she put it, properly resolved. The counterpunch came in November. Edmund produced, before the parish clerk, a sworn affidavit from a Millbrook labourer claiming the new will's witnessing, 3 years prior, had been irregular. The labourer swore he had signed a blank page, not a completed document. Cordelia read the affidavit twice, in Crane's office, with a calm that made the solicitor glance at her twice himself. "He has misdated it," she said finally, tapping the page. "He swears he witnessed the signing in March. My father was in Bath the whole of that March for his chest. I have the apothecary's bills to prove it, and 11 letters he wrote me from there, every one postmarked." "Well then," said Crane, allowing himself the smallest curve of satisfaction, "I believe we are ready for Justice Farrow." The hearing was convened in Millbrook's Assembly Hall, the largest room the parish had, because by the second week of December half the county wanted to attend, and Justice Farrow, a dry, exacting man who disliked spectacle almost as much as he disliked sloppy paper, had given up trying to keep it small. Cordelia stood at the long table with her father's true will before her, the mill key back at her throat, and told the room, in a voice that did not rise once, exactly what the documents said and exactly what they proved. She did not accuse. She asked questions. The way her father had taught her arithmetic was better than argument, and let the answers accuse for her. "You state," she said to Edmund, across the crowded hall, "that the will was witnessed in March, at this parish, by John Cobb here present." "That is correct," Edmund said, with the smooth confidence of a man who has rehearsed the sentence many times. John Cobb, Cordelia said, spent March of that year in Bristol, at his sister's lying in. There are 40 people in this room who could tell you so, because half of them wrote to him there. She turned to the room. Would anyone here care to say otherwise? Nobody did. John Cobb himself, red to the ears, stood up unbidden from the back benches to say he had never signed any such paper in his life, and would swear to it on whatever book the justice preferred. Simon Hale rose next, without being called, to describe the stranger's questions about the boundary stones. A Millbrook baker rose to describe the syndicate gentleman who had come asking in October about leasing the home farm cheap once the current arrangement lapsed. One by one, unbidden, the working people of Millbrook stood and added their small, unglamorous, devastating pieces of paper and memory to the pile, until Edmund Thorne's composure, never as thick as Delphine's had been, went out like a poorly banked fire, all at once, in front of everyone who had once tipped their hats to him out of habit. Justice Farrow required very little time to rule. The barony, the mill, and Thorne Hall's lands belonged, and had always belonged, to Cordelia Thorne Ashworth alone. The forged affidavit was struck. The matter of prosecuting Edmund for perjury was raised. Cordelia declined it. "I could ruin him," she said quietly, to the hushed hall, "and there are people here who would think me right to. But I would rather he leave Millbrook a chastened man than a jailed one, and I would rather this county remember what was proven here than what was punished." She looked at her cousin, whose face had gone the grey of a man doing arithmetic he had never expected to owe. "You will relinquish any further claim. In writing, today, you will not return to this parish while I hold it. That is the whole of my mercy, Edmund, and I would think carefully before you decide it is a small one." It was not a small one, and everyone in the hall who had watched him lose everything but his liberty understood exactly what it had cost her to grant it, and exactly what it had cost him to receive it. He signed. He left Millbrook within the fortnight, and did not return. Delphine Voss, who had not troubled to attend, was gone from the county entirely by January. Having married, it was later heard, a wool merchant in Bristol, who did not yet know the whole of her. Julian came to her that night at Thorne Hall, not Harrow, because it was where she had gone after the hearing to sit with Tobias Reed and a pot of tea, and the particular quiet of a woman who has just watched a room she feared change its mind about her in public. He did not begin with sorry. He had learned, by then, the difference she required. "My mother left when I was 11, he said, sitting across from her without being invited to, which she noted and allowed. My father told me, that same week, that affection was a debt clever people collected on, and honest people went bankrupt paying. I believed him for 20 years, because believing him meant I never had to risk finding out if he was right. I married you because you were solvent and steady, and I told myself that was the whole of what I wanted. It was not the whole. I only let myself think it was, because the rest frightened me considerably more than debt ever did. He stopped, started again. That is the explanation. I understand it is not the apology. I am sorry, separately and fully, for calling you useful in a room where you could hear it, and for 5 years of not asking what else you carried besides my accounts. Cordelia let the silence sit before she answered it. The way her father had taught her silence was itself a kind of arithmetic. I accept both, she said. Now hear my terms, because I mean to say them once, plainly, and not again. The barony and the mill remain mine, in law and in practice, whatever else happens between us, not as a threat, Julian, as a fact. The way the sun rises is a fact. Thorn Mill's wages are posted and fair, permanently, and you will not overrule them because you dislike a season's arithmetic. What concerns us both, we decide together and in writing, no more silence standing in for decisions. And I will forgive you at the pace I choose, not the pace that is convenient to your comfort. Julian was quiet a moment. All right, he said. All right, then, said Cordelia, and something in the room, she would think of it later as the house itself, seemed, for the first time in 5 years, to exhale. Spring came back to Millbrook the way it always did, indifferent to the winter it replaced, and Cordelia measured the change in her marriage the way she measured everything else, in small units, none of them significant alone. Julian began spending mornings at the mill, under Hale's instruction, learning to read a grain sample, the way he had once only learned to read a balance sheet, and Hale reported, dryly, that his Grace asked a great many questions, but at least had the sense to ask them of the man who knew the answers. In the estate office, he moved his chair, without comment, from across the desk to beside it, so that the ledgers they now shared lay between them, rather than facing each other like adversaries at a hearing. He learned to pour her tea before she asked, which the narration of her own private accounting flagged, more than once, as meaning nothing on its own and everything in accumulation. The relapse came in April, small and honest the way relapses in genuinely changed men tend to be. A dispute arose over a tenant's rent abatement after flooding, and Julian, out of 20 years of old habit, settled it alone before supper, and told her of it after, pleased with himself, expecting praise. Cordelia set down her fork. That was a decision that touched Thorn Land, she said, without heat. You made it without me. I am naming it, not to punish you, but because I said I would name it when it happened, and I keep my word even about small things. Julian went still. The particular stillness of a man who has been handed proof his old habits still have teeth. You're right, he said. I'll write to the tenant tonight, jointly, and correct it. He did. It was, Cordelia thought, the whole difference between the man who had married her for solvency and the man sitting across the shared ledger now, not that he no longer erred, but that he no longer needed to be forgiven quietly for erring, because he corrected it himself, in the open, without being managed into it. It was Tobias Reed, of all people, who provoked the declaration by asking Julian bluntly one evening on the stable steps whether he loved his wife or merely required her. I would choose her, Julian said, and it was not to Tobias he said it, because Cordelia had come out onto the steps behind them without either man hearing her. I have been choosing her for months now, quietly, in 100 small ways I hope she has noticed, even when I did not say it aloud. I mean to keep on choosing her, for as long as she'll let me, whether or not I ever find the words her father apparently found so easily. Cordelia, standing in the doorway with the mill key warm against her collarbone, found that she was, for the first time in longer than she could count, not counting anything at all. Not minutes, not grievances, not proofs required. She simply crossed the steps and stood beside him, and let herself, without ration, without a clock, cry. 2 years later, the brass key that had once hung at Cordelia's throat, as a private guarded thing, hung instead on a hook just inside the mill's front door, where any tenant or hand could take it down to open the account-house and check, for themselves, that the wages posted matched the wages paid. It was by then less a lock than an invitation, and the county had long since stopped remarking on it, the way people stop remarking on things that have simply become true. Edmund Thorne wrote once from a modest living in the north, a short, honest letter that asked for nothing and apologised, at last, without qualification. Cordelia read it twice and put it away without answering, which felt, she found, less like unfinished business than like a door closed correctly. Thorne Mill's wage board posted first in her own hand the autumn she stopped waiting to be noticed, still hung on the door, updated every quarter, signed jointly now by a duke who had learned to read a ledger the honest way, line by line, rather than trusting only the total. Beside the mill, in a converted grain store, a small school had opened that winter for the mill workers' children. Funded from the very contracts Cordelia had once renegotiated over 3 bakers and a pot of tea, and it would outlive, everyone privately suspected, every one of the people who had founded it. Harrow Hall, in the evenings, had a sound to it now that it had not had in the 5 cold years before, doors that opened without announcement, a duke and duchess arguing companionably over a boundary survey at the same desk, a house no longer holding its breath for the next silence to be filled with someone else's convenience. She had once been told she was useful, in a voice that thought the word was a kindness. She had once been told, by a cousin who wanted what was hers, that none of it, not the estate, not the mill, not the title, was really her own. Both men had been wrong in the same way, mistaking what a woman built quietly for a woman who could be quietly written out of it. She had not forgotten what was hers. She had simply let the county believe she might, until the paper said otherwise, and paper, as her father had always promised her, remembered what people forgot. She had stopped waiting to be loved for what she did. She had built a life so plainly, undeniably her own, that love, when it finally arrived, had no choice but to meet her on her ground, not because it was owed to her, but because it was, at last, true, and that was not a thing that could be taken from her. Not by a husband's careless word, not by a cousin's forged hand, not by anyone at all, because she had made certain, line by line, that it was written down.